pasa, HSI familia, and welcome back to ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? I'm your host, Dr. Gina Ann Garcia, and on this episode, we're going to discuss the current political climate for HSIs and strategies for advocating for Title III and Title V funding. What up, fam? Today we're going to dig into the politics of HSIs, the Department of Education, and of course, Title III and Title V funding. Since early 2025, we have seen the current administration attack HSIs in ways that seemed unfathomable just 1 year prior. Minority serving institutions have had bipartisan support for over 3 decades, with a steady increase of appropriations and funding to all 11 MSI programs, including mission-based and enrollment-based MSIs. MSIs enroll a large percentage of students of color, low-income students, and first-generation to college students, making them essential a sustainable future for the United States. If MSIs are unable to support holistically marginalized students, then who will? We know they provide access at very high rates and have been shown to be engines of economic and upward mobility. An attack on MSIs is an attack on our future, period. And while we can blame the executive branch for these attacks, the reality is that we as an MSI, HSI community have not been very loud about our dissatisfaction with the decisions being made that are affecting our institutions, our faculty, our staff, and our students. We have spent the last year stunned and dumbfounded, but haven't been very loud about our advocacy and demands. Today's guest is going to help us understand why it is essential for the entire MSI and HSI community to stand up, fight back, and demand that funding appropriated for HSIs and other enrollment-based MSIs be allocated as directed by Congress. I am joined by Amanda Fuchs Miller, who has more than 3 decades of experience working inside and outside of government. As president of 7th Street Strategies, Amanda works with higher ed institutions, nonprofit organizations, and foundations to provide advocacy, policy, oversight, and communication support. Amanda served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs in the Office of Post-Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education in the Biden-Harris administration, where she oversaw all the Title III and V programs. She also served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy, Planning, and Innovation, where she worked on the department's regulatory agenda and accreditation processes. Amanda previously served in several senior positions in the U.S. Senate and served at the Department of Justice in the Obama administration. Amanda graduated with a joint degree from Northwestern University School of Law and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and has her BA/BS from Boston University in political science and journalism. Super excited to have Amanda with us here today, joining us here on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? Amanda, thank you for joining us, where we talk about all things HSIs here on ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? But first, let's talk a little bit about you. So let's first hear about your, what we call the HSI journey, or your relationship to HSIs.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. It's my first podcast, so I'm very excited to be here. And it's about an issue that I've been talking about a lot over the last 16 months or so, in ways I didn't think I'd be talking about. So look forward to digging in today. But really, I've been familiar working in education policy around about HSIs and minority serving institutions, but my um, knowledge of it really stemmed over the last few years when I was at the Department of Education in the Biden-Harris administration, overseeing the Title III and V grant program. So working day to day with the grantees, with applicants, and shaping those programs is how I really got to know the work that the schools were doing.
Awesome. Okay, so what you're saying is you didn't attend an HSI?
I did not.
Many of us did not. I attended an emerging HSI. It was emerging at the time, but I always say I attended an HSI. It's been around for a long time. So tell us about your experience as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education, and specifically your knowledge and experience overseeing Title III and Title V programs.
Sure. So when I was appointed in 2023 to work in the Biden-Harris administration, my main role was overseeing all of the federal grant programs from the Office of Post-Secondary Education that went to post-secondary institutions. So most of those, actually the majority, it was about $3.6 billion a year, not counting all of the money that we got out for COVID emergency relief, but annually about $3.5 billion a year. And a lot of that was either directly for HSIs through the Title III and V grant programs, but we also, for a lot of our other grant programs where we were able to shape the priorities, directed a lot of that money towards HSIs and other MSIs, as well as HBCUs and TCCUs, because we recognized one, that that funding helped everybody at those schools, and that those schools and students really needed the funds, that they were under resourced. And so we really prioritize sending funds to schools like institutions like HSIs. And So specifically over the Title III and V programs, we oversaw so everything from when the money was appropriated, making sure we shaped the programs in the way that would most benefit the students at those schools, to overseeing the competition. I had a large career staff that worked on those grants and oversaw the competitions and getting out the mandatory money. And we did that over a long period of time. The appropriations process used to start a lot earlier, so we would be able to get that money out. And then working with the grantees throughout, and overseeing issues they had and making sure that that money was going out in the best possible way it could.
Okay, that's helpful. So a lot of our listeners probably have the most direct contact with their program officer. So I assume program officers were reporting up to you.
Yeah, so it was the federal bureaucracy, so we had a lot of levels, but yes, there were program officers who worked on each specific grant program, and the grantees were sort of
Hmm.
divided among them, and then they sort of reported up to directors, and then ultimately up to the political staff.
Okay, good to know. Just because that I think most people that's who they have the most direct
Yeah,
contact with, right? Like they know
yeah,
their program officers. I assume like they have meetings, they reach out, like that's their one contact, right? At the department. So an important contact, obviously.
yeah. And one of the
Awesome.
issues when we talk
So
about what's happened over the last year, finding those program officers is becoming harder. So we can talk about that as well in terms of the
mm,
changes.
oh wow, yeah. And I assume a lot of them have lost their jobs, right?
Yeah, so most of them were not rift, or at least the court overturned those firings,
Mhm,
and so they're still there if they've
mhm,
chosen to be there. But as you've seen, there's these interagency agreements which the department is doing, and they've detailed a lot of those staff to other agencies. We can talk a little bit about what that will mean for the grant programs, but some of them
mm,
it's just hard to find. They're overworked. They have more work than usual. They're not getting as much
mm.
information possibly as they used to, and so I always tell all the grantees to be nice to their program officers, but this is as hard of a time, I think, a challenging time for the staff, the career staff as well. But yeah, they're the ones that really do the day-to-day interactions with the grantees, help them do that oversight over their grant, help them answer any TA questions.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, that's helpful. So let's talk about the current climate. I know you are constantly sharing so much information with us on LinkedIn, trending on LinkedIn, right? In wild ways because you're sharing so much really good information with us. So talk to us about the current political climate for HSIs and more importantly, what's happening now regarding the designation and funding and even what's changing, right? You talked about this a little bit. What's changing in the department that you know of, right? I know you're not there obviously anymore. That would be helpful for us to know.
Sure. So, HSIs have been designated in the Higher Education Act for more than 30 years. They are in statute. They are set the way they are because of the requirements set in statute by Congress. And then every year in the appropriations bill, Congress funds those programs. So they fund them sort of in two pots of money. They fund the discretionary programs, which are for HSIs, the POA program for graduate students and developing HSI,
Mhm,
and those are competitive grant programs that they run every year based on what Congress tells you you have money for. And then there's also mandatory money in what's called the Futures Act, which is money that's authorized, and that's where HSI STEM is one of those programs. And that money, a certain
mhm,
amount of money, has to go out every year, regardless of if it's appropriated. And a competition is usually run for that. So that's how it's worked for 3 decades. And every
mhm,
administration has different priorities and shapes their grant programs differently, and they have a right to do that. What we saw last year is a couple of things. So I'll sort of work my way chronologically, right? So, first,
mhm,
we saw that, sort of the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly. And no one knew exactly what that meant. The executive orders came out, they were broad, but it really raised some flags of what is going to happen to grant programs and funding programs that they can view as diversity, equity, inclusion. Which I will say is not the MSI programs, but I'll explain that in a minute, since that funding helps all students. But we were worried from the beginning. So, I was worried before they took office, I was worried afterwards. And we had seen some lawsuits around other grant programs that had some of these priorities in the past. They hadn't gone anywhere. So in 2025, all the grants were late, all the announcements were late. I think they were sort of getting up to speed. But we were anticipating this. So when the Department of Ed published their first competition for an HSI Title III grant program or Title V grant program, I forget which program it was, but they published their competition. There was immediately a lawsuit from the Tennessee Republican Attorney General and a group called
Mhm.
SFFA, which people might know of from the SFFA v.
Oh,
Harvard case, yeah, which we'll come
yes.
back to, but which talked about how admissions based on race is unconstitutional. So there was a lawsuit from Tennessee saying because we don't qualify for any of these programs, you can't give out the money based on this eligibility status. And it was specifically around HSIs, although would have probably applied to any of them, but based on the 25% of enrollment of Hispanic students that's required in statute. The Department of Education used this moment to say that they weren't going to defend the statute, which is pretty much unprecedented. Generally, the job of the Department of Justice is to defend any statute. So, and that's usually what they do, even if they disagree with it on a policy area. But they said, we believe, based on our views on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and based on this SFFA v. Harvard case, that these grant programs, the way they're structured, are unconstitutional, and we're not going to defend the statute. So it could have gone away then, but other people could intervene, it's called, as a defendant, and Haku, which represents a lot of HSIs, intervened. And so they were granted the right to intervene, although that case is sort of on hold and hasn't moved. So we'll have to see where that goes. So we'll come back to that. Then
Mhm.
came the time to give out these grant programs. And the Department of Ed, I'm going to get a little wonky, but I will then try to bring it back up, which is the Department of Ed, gives out their grants. Congress tells them how much money they have for each program. There's also a
Mhm.
provision in the appropriations bill called reprogramming authority that lets Congress with permission or the executive branch with permission from Congress to move around some of that money. And basically,
Mhm.
we've used that in the past if, for example, we didn't have enough applications from one type of school, but we got too many applications from another, and we wanted to make sure we spent the money, we would ask them if we can move some of it around. It is not
Mm.
intended to just end programs overall, um,
Mm.
but they do have that authority. Combine that
Right.
with last year, we had a year-long continuing resolution, which meant that it was just a very thin bill that said you have to spend money the way you did the year before. Everything's level funded, but it
Mhm.
didn't have the report, which is attached to the bill, which tells you how much money Congress wants you to spend on each program. So
Mm.
that on top of this reprogram authority, the administration believed gave them even more authority. I think many of us, including appropriators, may say, we said you had to spend it like last year, so we still intended you to spend it on the same programs, but it wasn't in writing. And so they had a little even more they were empowered to move around that money. And we didn't know what they would do. We didn't know if they would just impound that money, what they would do, but they ended up reprogramming all of that discretionary Title III and V money as they were allowed in the statute to HBCUs and TCCUs. And
Right.
so they moved that money and sent a letter on September 10th saying, we're going to give all this money to HBCUs and TCCUs. You could draw down and keep spending the money you have, but we're not going to give you more money. I don't know if I should say this on the
Right.
podcast, but I like to almost call it hush money a little bit because it did get the other
Okay.
groups to not say as much, which, in their defense, they got this money. They also need the money. Um, but a
Yes.
lot of what this administration is trying to do is pit one type of school against another, whether it's a Harvard versus a community college, whether it's a Anna versus a HBCU. And really, we should all be advocating for the same for the funding that Congress
Right.
has designated and to follow those laws and follow the processes.
Right.
So that money was reprogrammed, which again was legally allowable, but shocking to the
Right.
HSI community. And
Right.
And what they said in that letter is, we believe that these programs are unconstitutional because of this SFFA decision, which I'll get back to in a second. And so we're going to reprogram the money. In the mandatory space, the mandatory funds that I talked about, which are in an authorizing bill, which they didn't have the authority to reprogram, they said, we're going to give those out again this year. And we're going to keep research, like looking into whether or not we're allowed to do that, because if it's unconstitutional, we can't spend the money. So that was what they did
Right.
last year. In December, the Department of Justice, who makes these decisions, issued a memo making very clear that they believe that all of these programs, the way HSIs are set in statute, around 25% enrollment, is a violation of SFFA v. Harvard. It's unconstitutional. So I will say this, you'll probably hear me say it again at least once in the podcast, but the executive branch cannot declare a statute unconstitutional. Only the judiciary branch can declare a statute unconstitutional. And so
Yeah.
they but they declared unconstitutional and sort of said, we don't think that this administration should give out the money. So that was in
Right.
December, and that hasn't happened yet. This year, then we got the fiscal year 26 appropriations, and Congress, who does still believe that there should be money given to minority serving institutions for the most part, refunded, gave money again to HSIs, but because they couldn't get the bipartisan support to do so, while in every other grant program, they made it harder to reprogram that money. They put them in what's called its own accounts.
Mhm.
The Title 3 and 5 money
Mhm.
were all in one bucket of Title 3 and 5, which means that they could legally reprogram that money within that bucket. So it's all of the MSI programs, as well as the Strengthening Institution Program grant, SIP. Um, SIP has the same requirements for eligibility as the other Title 3 and 5 grants without the enrollment criteria. So it has the high needy student and low expenditures, which are two of the three criteria to be an MSI, but it doesn't have any kind of specific enrollment. So that's what you could still, they were allowed to reprogram that money. That's what we anticipated that they would do. Now, there's also, remember, that mandatory money they can't reprogram. So they should legally give that out. So then the last part, and then I'll take a breath, but the last part was that we saw, we've been waiting for the eligibility matrix to come out. And what as wonky as I was just now, the eligibility matrix is even wonkier and no one knows about it.
Right.
But again, the Department of Ed does not declare a school an HSI. They just declare them eligible for Title III and Title V funds. And so in order to be eligible, what they have to do is there are three ways you could become eligible. One is the Department of Ed looks at a bunch of information in those three categories: enrollment, high needy students, and low expenditures. And you may fit all three, and then you're just designated an HSI for purpose of Title 3 and 5, and they send you a letter, or you have to you access a letter. The second is you apply. So the application, which usually comes out in January, came out last week, and we expected, it doesn't mention the MSI program. So it says, it doesn't say they're definitely not going to do it. It doesn't, but usually it explains to schools so they know
Right.
if you want to apply for a SIP grant or an HSI grant, you need to apply. It only mentions SIP specifically. It says as an example again. So if there's enough pushback, maybe they come around, but basically it said you can
Mm.
apply, and if you apply, you again submit that information about your high needy students, your low expenditures, and then the department would pull whatever information they need, and that puts you on what's called an eligibility matrix, that comes out later in the year, and that tells you if you could apply for one of these grant programs. So if you're designated HSI, you could apply for HSI STEM, POA, or DHSI. Um, and
Mhm.
that matrix would come out. So because the eligibility application doesn't mention these programs, it's pretty telling that they're not going to give out
Mhm.
that money. Um,
Right.
so I'll pause there in case you have questions, but I think that's, that's sort of, a lot has happened in that. There's a very broad question. A
A
lot
lot
has
has
happened in
happened.
the last year. But I think what it comes down to
Yeah.
is we anticipate that they won't compete that money or give out the mandatory money, and for the competition, they'll just sort of move it around so that they don't have to declare any schools HSIs.
Right. Okay, so that's a lot. Probably more happened in 1 year than like 25
Yeah.
years of
People
HX.
just thought, I mean, I
Besides,
talk to people and I give this whole spiel and I explain it. And then I will have somebody raise their hand and say to me, great, that's horrible. Now, when will the application be out for the HSI program? Because for 30
you're like,
years, it just did. It just did. Executive branch used to follow Congress's intent. They thought, I think, and
yeah.
they just followed what they could do, and they had bipartisan support, and this money just went out the door. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yep, and we just kinda got used to it.
yeah,
So, if I can summarize, correct me if I'm wrong, HSIs are still constitutional. The law has not changed. They still exist, and particularly, I always say they still exist because your students are still there,
yeah,
right? Like, as an enrollment-based, designation, the students are still enrolled, right? Like, you still have the students, so you're still
yeah,
enrolling the same number. Congress, Department of Ed, this administration, nobody ever told you that that was the case. That's the case.
yeah.
Your students are there, right? So students are still there, and per the Constitution, well, I guess per Congress and the Higher Education Act, HSI still exists.
And
Correct?
more importantly, the funding is still those schools are eligible for federal funding because that's really what the
Yeah.
thing. Again, the statute doesn't say if you're an HSI, but it says you're eligible for this funding if you meet these things.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Right. Okay. This administration has chosen to, as my colleague Stephanie Aguilar Smith says, starve the programs, right? Like
yeah,
starve the institution by not funding them, right? But the reality is they still exist, and assuming a new administration comes in 2.5 years, we're all hoping, then we would assume that maybe they would come back, right? The funding will come because,
exactly.
like you said, it's just the funding moment. So, okay, so there's hope, HSI community, right? We don't have a crystal ball. We're not predicting anything. We're just saying, it is what it is. HSIs are still constitutional, despite the Department of Justice's memo. So you have suggested, I mean, I've been following along your work and your posts and your the articles you've been featured in. You're suggesting that people apply for, HSI community and the MSI community apply for the go through the eligibility process, and consider applying for SIP. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the SIP money, the Title 3 and 5 money are all have the same allowable uses for the same purposes, really to serve under resource schools and to serve all the so that is a pot of money that is still available to you and well, there have been these ways that it's been divided by program, but it doesn't have to
Hmm.
be, and that pool of money is still there. So, and you're already meeting those two requirements for SIP if you are meeting them for HSIs because it's actually one less requirement. So, if you should
Hmm.
still check to see if you've been deemed eligible based on the department's data, or apply to be get because you also to apply for SIP have to be deemed eligible as SIP eligible. So if you meet those
Hmm.
other characteristics, which are the same, I would recommend applying, and then if we don't know for sure, but if they just have a
Hmm.
mega SIP competition, which is what we assume on the discretionary side, we think they will that we encourage you to apply for those funds because those are funds Congress wanted you to have.
Right. So you can apply and you can do the work you would have done otherwise with your Title 5 and Title 3,
Yeah.
right? Except
You might need to
that it's
frame
now not
your project a little differently, but yes, you could still serve your students in the same way.
in the same sort of way. So consider that, community.
Yeah,
Please, know that the work doesn't stop, and we need to be creative with the funding sources, right? At
exactly.
this point, and I think it goes to my next question is like, what recommendations do you offer to the MSI HSI community on like what are potential other sources, including like federal sources, right? Like obviously MSIs, there are other MSI programs outside of the Department of Ed, right?
Yeah.
Like NSF has had one, Department of Defense, right? Like USDA, like the different agencies have had other programs as well. So any suggestions on what other maybe strategies of like of finding funding within the federal government, but then even beyond, right? I know you're working beyond the federal government as well. Other places that people can think about finding funding for this work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know this for sure and I don't track them as well, but my guess is those other programs, which often the other agencies actually rely on our matrix at the Department of Ed to determine whether schools they don't
Mm,
have to, but they often do. They don't do something similar.
right.
Um and it's the same administration. So my guess is those minority serving institutions specific funding programs at AG and DOD and NSF will likely be in the same some of them and won't be competed. So, but
Right.
I think two things. One is I think, and I can talk about it more afterwards, of like, don't the mandatory funds again is a different pot of money, and they do have to give those out. They don't have reprogramming authority, and so we could talk later about how to push back on that. um, I know states have grant programs, and I would look more generally at the grant programs at the department, which are all designed for schools that are under resourced and need funding, whether it's C Campus or FIPSI or other grants that are just not specific to HSIs. Now you'll be competing with a bigger group of people, so that's harder. But there's a lot of other funds that are all designed, and because your funding always went to a whole big broad range of allowable activities, not just serving Hispanic students on your campuses, you may be able to do the same work with some of these other grant programs depending on what they do with them.
Hmm. Okay. So be creative, be diligent, stay aware. um, all hope is not lost. We're just strategizing, right, for now. Um, but I guess the alternative question is not just how do we, work with what we've been dealt here, but also how can the HSI community be better as far as advocacy, right? I know me and you have talked, and we've talked about how we haven't been loud enough, right? I said that in the intro.
Yeah.
The HSI community hasn't been loud enough. Like we should have been very loud when this money was all being reprogrammed. So what can the HSI community do now as far as advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think there's a short term and kind of a long term strategy. So the short term is again, Congress told the department they wanted this money to go out, even though it's not in the language of the bill, so it can be reprogrammed. In the report that I mentioned, which doesn't have the force of law, but shows Congress's intent, they did fund specifically the POA program, the DHSI program, and then strengthening Anna Peasy program. So they show they wanted that money funded.
Right.
Their HSIs have a lot very broad representation, and a lot of them are in red states. And so they should be hearing, your members of Congress need to be hearing from you about two things. One is about the impact of the loss of funding, and two is just why you need that funding and the work you're doing. And I would think about doing the advocacy differently. So I would think about, first of all, storytelling is always key to that. And I think there's just an assumption that the members of Congress know. And there's so much stuff happening that the staff may not even realize that these grants got canceled, or that there's a difference between discretionary and mandatory. So really sort of understanding the issues to be able to explain it to them, because I don't think they even, if you weren't on the committee, I don't even think they understood all the nuances about this, what the matrix was and how you get designated. And so explaining that to them, being a resource, and then really telling your stories and thinking about a broad range of messengers to do that. So I mentioned how their goal is to sort of divide and conquer, but the HSI should be
Mhm.
up there with the PBIs and the ANAPZs and the ANAs, to broaden their reach, because they're all being hit the same way. So I think
Mhm.
telling your story, telling about both the impact of the funds and the losses, telling them to a broad range of members of Congress, whether they agree with you if you're in a blue state or they don't agree with you, because they just need to hear from you. And we have been hearing stories about behind the scenes Republicans who've been quieter than they should about their appropriations and their power of their purse. But behind the scenes, they are making calls, and that it's helping. So they need to hear the
Mhm.
outrage from you all and about what's actually happening to be able to push back on the
Mhm.
administration. And we've seen that with other programs like TRIO, where
Mhm.
there are loud voices. So the first thing I would say, that's the first thing I would say about the short term advocacy. And again, think about who to bring with you. Who are the connections? Who's on your board? Who are the businesses in your community that wouldn't be able to survive if they didn't have graduates from your program or workers from your
Mhm.
program? They may not listen to
Right.
you as an HSI, but they may they should as a constituent, but they also may have
Mhm.
relationships, or that some of those other things may work into their framing more. And then the other thing I would say on the long term piece is, I do think that unfortunately, once that lawsuit that we mentioned a while ago moves up, that they're right now, as I said, they're not unconstitutional. This funding's not unconstitutional. This is not, as you all know, about admissions. It's about enrollment. The SFA case
Right.
was only about admissions. But if this court case gets up to the Supreme Court, then it's the same court, and they may say, yes, that case was about admissions,
Mhm.
and now we think enrollment is also unconstitutional. And if they do that, it will be too late to do anything. So now is the time, and this is going to be more controversial, I think, with a lot of HSIs, but we may need to redo that statute in a way that the same schools and the same students could benefit from the funds. There was an article I think that I know you're going to link to that talked about that had Republicans quoted as wanting to fix this, whether it's for Native
Right.
students or Hispanic students or Asian American students. And so I think having thinking now, it's not really long term, it's coming soon, is
Right.
how could we maybe think about ways to change the framing of how it is? Some people think it is
Right.
odd that to be an Anapisi, you need 10%, and to be an Ana uh, HSI, you need 25%. And, it's a 30-year-old
Right.
old law, and a lot of things in our country have changed. And so we have to be willing to change that and to work. And I know that there are both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill who are looking for ideas. And so this is your time to say, how can I get the
Mhm.
same money and benefit the same students, do the same work, but maybe in a different framing? Doesn't mean you're still not an HSI in other contexts, but for the funding, and let's do that before it gets struck down in the court, because then it is too late to fight for those funds.
Right. Okay. Whew, all right. That was good. That was a lot of good information. I like the idea of working with like your local constituents who benefit from the students, right? Obviously that you're educating and that are graduating from the campus. I think a lot about the president's role in this work, and I think presidents and chancellors have a lot more political cloud and sort of savviness. Like their job is to be political, right? To speak. So
Mhm.
any thoughts on that? Like for those people, there are people that are listening. If it's not the president, they have the ear of the president, right? Like they are the chief of staff or they're someone close to the president. Any thoughts on what our president, because I keep thinking our president should be doing more, like
Yes, do not
what
be
can they be doing?
afraid to do advocacy. It is not, I
Mm-hmm.
understand. So
Mm.
I think on the mandatory funds, this is a little side, but on the mandatory funds,
Right.
I do think what they're doing is illegal if they decide not to give out these funds. We need to do the advocacy to make
Right.
sure we can't give up on them yet. They may, this is the time to pressure them to, at least for the mandatory money, to include HSIs in that eligibility matrix. So we should keep pushing for that. But we also have this matrix, and someone should be suing, right? We've seen litigation really working for us in most cases, at least in the short term. And so we
Right.
should think about that. And that is a role that presidents and chancellors can think about, and
Right.
associations if they're afraid to do it. I understand the litigation is scary. So that's what, but I don't want people to rule it out. And we need the
Right.
plaintiffs to be, if plaintiff, we need the people who are being impacted to be plaintiffs, or we can't bring a lawsuit. So that's one thing to think about. It's, again, especially on the mandatory and the discretionary. Unfortunately, I think they can do this, so it's really about the advocacy. So that's one thing the presidents, chancellors could think about. But the other thing is I've seen
Right.
is that they are afraid to do anything, and this is not just about HSIs. This is about higher ed generally. And we
Right.
need to tell our stories. I often say that when I was in the Senate, I only heard from colleges when they needed an earmark or they needed to not have an endowment tax, because people just
Right.
assumed. So there's the specific advocacy around HSIs, which is in the urgent moment. But in the, again, a little bit longer term, presidents need to be thinking about maybe reforms they do need to make, probably less at HSIs than in some other
Right.
schools, but at all schools, and make those reforms and then tell their story. They need to tell their story to those folks. The advocacy has to come from the president, students, because they really have the firsthand stories, but it also needs to come from the presidents and chancellors because they have the relationships and the board members. So they need to be up there talking to their members of Congress, and they can't be afraid, like, oh, well, if I go advocate, then they're going to be mad at me, and then they're not going to give what else could they take away? They have taken away all your funding, so you have not much to lose. So you should advocate. um and
Yeah.
also you're a constituent, so I actually don't even think it's viewed as bad. I get the, like, litigation is scarier, although I think people should still do that.
Right.
um, but I will say I was working with some folks about comments on something, a new rule that would affect schools. And I heard from a lot of college presidents, like, oh, well, we don't want to submit comments in our name because, they're going to retaliate. If we get afraid to advocate or comment on things, like that is like how the democratic process and democracy works. So you have to
Right.
do it. I understand you have risk assessments you have to do for your own schools. So make sure all the presidents are doing it, or come together and do it, or do it, jointly. But until, if they think that, you're going to just cave, then there's not incentive for them to keep fighting. And the members of Congress are going to fight for the people who are loudest, not for the people who they aren't hearing for. So
Right.
we need it from the
Yeah.
top. We need it throughout the spectrum of stakeholders, from presidents all the way to
Mm.
students.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's helpful. Well, even when you talk about litigation is scary, I'm like, yeah, but like our presidents have legal counsel.
Yeah,
Like they're surrounded,
yeah,
universities. I mean, I think about my campus, our campus is surrounded,
yeah,
like we are constant, our council is very tight. We have to be so that we don't get sued, right? Like constantly, particularly with this federal government. So,
yeah,
so your president shouldn't be scared of that in particular.
yeah,
So, but yeah, that's something I've been advocating for is like, how can we get our like presidents
yeah,
involved, right? In this advocacy. I know we've talked a lot about, me and you personally, as far as like, should people be calling? Should they email? Like, any thoughts on that? Like, what is the best way to get through to the
yeah.
people that are gonna hear you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like do meetings, reach out to the staff, the education staff person for your member of
Mhm.
Congress, do meetings, ask for a meeting. You could do it when they're home in the districts. You could do it come to DC. You could do it on, now you could do it on Zoom. It's much
Right.
easier to meet with folks. We could used to do that. Used to be able to call
Yeah.
people. I feel like the Hill staff no longer have telephones, which may be a generational thing. So they'd rather have a Zoom call, which I'm still working to go back to the phones. But you need to, tell them your stories. So that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
So use their education staffer, and then think about who you have relations, who you're in your network sort of power map to see who have relationships with the
Mm.
members themselves. So that might be your board
Mhm.
members. That might again be um, your deans or your presidents, or work through your association and let them know you're going to be here. But just reach them in any way you can, and I would say, both tell your stories but also explain the process and what's happening, because they might not know, and then have a specific ask. So I know, like, it's great that Congress gave more money this year to HSIs, but we sort of have been touting that win, even though they don't have to spend any money on HSIs, right? So it is great, but don't let them get away with that. So ask them to make sure that that money goes to HSIs, and that they're holding the administration accountable for those funds.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. All right, so we've given you lots of Amanda. I'm not gonna say we. Amanda's giving you a lot to think about, y'all. Listen, take notes, rewind, because we need to be advocating, right? Like, and Amanda's just a great person to help us. 'Cause I think a lot of us just don't know,
Yeah.
right? Like we just institutions and hope money comes our way. We're like, well, bring the money so we can do stuff. And we just can't do that right
Yeah.
now. So this season on the podcast, we are discussing grief. So I wanted to ask you, how are you grieving the slow death of the Department of Education, of Title V, the defunding of programs and supports that have historically served minoritized students, and basically all this, what stuff? How are you grieving that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I tell people that, like, working with colleges and stakeholders to sort of understand and advocate, it's just what I'm doing my consulting work. I feel like it's like you could feel like you're making a difference in a small piece while the rest of the world is blowing up. And I don't really look at the news to see what's happening everywhere else. But I think, one, I guess a couple things. One is, I just feel like part of the issue is just no one has any information. So, for example, last year when these grants were getting terminated, nobody even knew what that meant, what was allowable, how they could appeal. So, sort of helping, um, sort of channeling my grief into helping people individually, right, and collectively, kind of both understand what's happening and then know where to push back. And then I think just having the information and trying to share that out as best as I could, hopefully is helping.
Mhm.
I think the other thing I think is thinking about how to rebuild back better, not to steal a phrase from our former president, but how to build back better, like, in the future, right? Like, I do think,
Mhm.
which we didn't focus on today, but I think, like, we need to think about, again, when this statute is constitutional, what should we do? We don't often think about these things ahead of time, right? How are we going to rebuild the Department of Education, right? It's going to be there. It's going to be really sort of decimated, but the administration
Right.
can't get rid of it. So it's going to be there. It might be in a different, it seems like now it's going to be in the former USAID building instead of the Ed building, but it will be somewhere. They're moving it. But but so how do we sort of rebuild the federal government and the agencies and to support the
Mm.
work we're all doing in different ways, which I think is hard. I think, as you said, like we've just been funded, whether it's in HSI or other programs, the same way for 30 years. You just expected it. People loved higher ed. People don't love higher ed anymore. So you need to sort of explain why it's still so important and tell those stories. So both between the advocacy and sort of thinking policy wise is sort of how I'm trying to maybe not grieve, but move the ball forward a little bit.
Right, for sure. No, that's good. Yes, you did mention we might come back to this. So something you said made me think about it. This idea that a lot of the stuff, the functions of the Department of Ed have been going out to different departments. Is that true? Like even the like eligibility process, is that sort of through Department of Ed? I've heard like Department of Labor is going to be distributing some of that money. Like you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so they've moved all the grant programs to different programs. So the HSI programs are working out of the Department of Labor. I mean, there are not going to
Okay.
be
Yeah.
HSIs, but SIP, for example, will be coming out of the Department of Labor,
Yeah.
the Title 3 5 programs.
Right.
It's the same staff, so your program staff are probably the same. They have probably moved to the Department of Labor temporary. They're sitting in the Department of Labor. Um, they are, the president issued an executive order that he wanted to shut the Department of Education down. Congress funded the Department of Education, created the Department of Education. The executive branch, just like they don't have authority to declare a statute unconstitutional, can't just eliminate the Department of Education. So what I think they're trying to
Right.
do is um, sort of do a lot of things for the optics of showing that we don't need a Department of Education to convince the Republicans to shut it, to get rid of it. So, which they've been
Right.
trying to do forever. So they're moving people, but your old grants, for example, if you are lucky to still have a grant, a Title 3 5 grant, that money is you're still working through the Department of Education system and coming out of the system. If you get a SIP grant this year, you will use the Department of Labor's grant system, management system. And so,
Right. Okay.
they say it's to return education to the states. It's like double the bureaucracy. So I'm not sure how it's returning it. It's actually worse because now you have to deal with two federal
Right.
agencies, which didn't work so well all the
Right.
time in the first place. But yeah, so they're moving people. So the work should be the same. If, for example, you apply for the SIP, but you may be dealing with a different agency, and the grants are coming out like jointly. So the eligibility matrix actually did come out this year from the Department of Ed, I think in conjunction with the Department of Labor.
Right.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
It's
helpful.
just more
Okay.
chaos and confusion for the grantees because they don't want people to try to get this federal money. But it's more reason why you have to be steadfast in figuring out so that you do get the money that you deserve.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. All right. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you would have liked to tell the HSI community that's listening?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sorry for what everyone's going through, but again, I think we just need to think about how both to set ourselves up for the future. We last year, I think a
Mhm.
lot of people were blindsided. We should have known a little bit of this was coming, but it came fast and
Yeah.
furious more than anyone could have expected. They were really ready. And again, just keep pushing back and fighting for it. And it may be ideal, as I like to say, like he won, things are different. They're going to be a little different, but it doesn't mean you can't still do the good work for your students and stay true to your mission in doing that work.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So the final question of the podcast is the name of the podcast. The podcast is called ¿Qué pasa HSIs? Or What's up HSIs? What's happening HSI? So I always ask guests, that's the final question. ¿Qué pasa HSIs?
Go talk to your member of Congress. They're all home right now. They will be back
That
again
part.
this summer. They'll be around a lot this summer. Talk to your members of Congress and their staff, and bring along all your in a broad coalition, and just tell your stories and convince them why this funding has been there and been needed for 30 years and is still needed. And serving all the students and your all your communities in the way that it is.
Awesome. Thank you for joining me today on ¿Qué pasa HSIs?
Thank you for having me.